Well, I happen to think that this idea that various things, are predicated of Christ in virtue of one or the other nature, I happen to think that this idea is very problematic. The New Testament everywhere says, for example, Christ was empowered by God, he was authorized by God to do this or that. I'll give you an example. If you are dead, I cannot make you dead, right? You can't kill a dead person because they're already dead. Let's say I take this shirt and I dip it in water and it's soaked. Okay, if it's soaked, I can't make it wet because it already is wet. If a house is destroyed, I can't destroy the house because it's already destroyed. If someone is alive, you can't make them live because they're already alive. So if something is already of a certain quality, you cannot make it have that quality. Now, sometimes you can be a certain way and you can be made more that way. So, for example, a fat cat can be made fatter, a rich man can be made richer. But Christ, according to nature's view, possesses the divine nature. When he becomes a human being, he does not cease being God. Okay, so he does not cease to be God in becoming a human being. So his divine nature remains. Everything that is true about him in virtue of his divine nature remains. In that case, Christ being God would already have power, would already have authority. And so, in the first place, it would be superfluous for him to be empowered or to be authorized by God because he already has power and authority. In the second place, it would be impossible for him to be authorized or empowered by God because he already has power and authority. So any divine quality that you can think of, because if Christ were God, he would already have that quality to the maximal degree. And so he cannot be given those qualities. I think, for example, of the text, what does it say there? That he was exalted high above the angels, he was made superior to them insofar as the name that he has inherited is greater than theirs, and so on. Well, think, if Christ was already God, then he could not be made higher than the angels because he is already higher than the angels. And the text, nowhere in the Bible will you ever have the sentence that says that Christ was made higher than the angels or he was empowered or whatever in his humanity. That doesn't exist. That passage does not exist in the Bible. It simply says that Christ was empowered. He was authorized. He was made superior to the angels. He inherited a name more greater than theirs. So if Christ were already God, he would already have all those things, and they could not be given to him because they would already belong to him by nature. So because you cannot be given what you already have, it seems to me that the Bible's way of talking suggests against this. The way that the Bible talks about Jesus suggests that he is not divine by nature, precisely because he is said to be empowered by God, authorized by God, made, exalted by God, and so on. And there is never a hint in any of these texts that these things are only true of him in virtue of his human nature. So with respect to this text about Christ dying also, if Christ dies, well, if he has a divine nature, then he's also living, because the divine nature is immortal and Christ does not cease to be God and becoming human. So he dies and he's alive. I've thought about this. Paul, for example, in in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he considers that if Christ was not raised from the dead, then it is futile to believe in him, right? He says, if Christ was not raised from the dead, then your faith is in vain and your hope is in vain. Now, if Christ has two natures, that's strictly speaking not true, because even as a dead human being, Christ would still be God. And it still makes sense to believe in God. So it would still make sense to believe in Christ, even if he had died as a human being, because he does not cease to be God. And yet Paul says that if Christ has died and there's no resurrection of the dead, then there is no point in believing in Christ. Now that suggests to me that for Paul, Christ did not continue to live after he had died. Right? If he were not raised from the dead, he would be dead, and that would be it. And if that's true, then Christ could only have one nature, a human nature, which, if it's dead, it can do nothing more for you. If Christ had two natures, then even though he's dead in his human nature, he would still be alive and omnipotent in his divine nature, and he could still help you. What's interesting in that passage in 1 Corinthians is that Paul even considers that the death of Christ would not have affected God. He says, look, if Christ died and he was not raised from the dead, nothing changes about God. He is still God. It's just that we're now in trouble because we're saying that God was raised him from the dead and he didn't. So Paul has in mind that Christ's death without a resurrection would not have affected God. But obviously, if Christ were God himself, then his death without a resurrection would also not have affected him because he would still be alive in his divinity. It seems to me that if you have this notion of Christ as one person and two natures, you just make nonsense out of the way that Paul talks. It seems to me that Paul's reasoning implies that Christ has one nature, a human nature, and if he wasn't raised from the dead, then he can do nothing for you. God can still do something for you, but Christ can't because Christ is only a human. I notice this a lot. People reference the logic of the two natures in order to bring in the divinity when it's convenient for them. But the divinity is always there, right? So even when Christ is dead, he's still immortal and all-powerful as God. So it seems like they forget that the divinity is not affected by what happens to the humanity in the classical Catholic tradition. And this makes nonsense of the New Testament's reasoning about Christ.
I had a debate recently, and my opponent held to the communicatio here. What is true of each nature, he said, is true of the one person. Did you ever adopt this? Did you ever use this as a Trinitarian?
Oh yeah, this is like, Trinitarian Doctrine 101, Chalcedonian Doctrine 101. If Christ is a person in two natures, then you have to really be specific in your way of speaking, because nature, philosophically speaking, nature is what defines what a thing is, right? I'm a human being because I have a human nature. I'm not identical to human nature because you have a human nature too, and I'm not you, but I am a human being and I'm defined by my human nature. Well, if Christ is a person with two natures, then he has two things that are defining him. There's the divine nature and the human nature, and these things, both, without confusing, without intermingling, without separating, and so on, Christ is defined equally by both of these natures. Well, if that's true, then we cannot, even though Christ was born, he grew up, he suffered, he died, he was raised from the dead. All these things are true of him in virtue of his humanity. It's also true of him that he was not born, he did not grow, he did not suffer, he did not die, and he was not raised from the dead, because all these things are true of him in virtue of his divinity. So what happens is that when you have divinity and humanity together in a single person, you can then begin to start talking about the one Christ in ways that seem contradictory. He died and he didn't die. He died in his humanity. He didn't die in his divinity. He was raised from the dead and he wasn't raised from the dead. He wasn't raised from the dead in his divinity because he didn't die, and you can't raise what hasn't died. But he was raised from the dead in his humanity because he did die. So again, it seems to me like Paul, I turn back to Paul in 1 Corinthians. The idea is that either Christ was raised from the dead or he wasn't. If he was raised from the dead, then great, our preaching is true. If he wasn't raised from the dead, then, Christianity is false. But what's interesting is where Paul sees an excluded middle. He says you have to have one or the other. Chalcedonian theology actually allows for both of them to be true. It can be true that he was raised from the dead and that he wasn't raised from the dead. So Chalcedonian theology allows you to have both sentences. Paul's theology makes you choose between one or the other. Now that suggests to me that Paul is not a Chalcedonian. He does not think of Christ in terms of two natures. He thinks of Christ as one nature, which is mortal. And if he dies and God doesn't raise him from the dead, then it's over. He can't do anything for you. So once again, it seems to me that if you pay attention to the way that Paul reasons in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you will see that he does not consider Christ a person in two natures. He does not consider him to be the God-man. He thinks that he's a man who, if God didn't raise him from the dead, he could do nothing for you. But that wouldn't be true of him if he were also God.